On the morning of September 12, 1959, CIA officer John McMahon received a cable at Langley headquarters that would set in motion one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War. The message, encoded and transmitted from Mexico City Station, contained just 4 words: "Lunik is in transit." For 18 months, the agency had been tracking Soviet space technology with an obsession bordering on desperation. The launch of Sputnik in October 1957 had shocked American intelligence planners who had convinced themselves that Soviet rocketry lagged years behind Western capabilities. When Sputnik 2 carried the dog Laika into orbit just 1 month later, and Luna 1 became the first spacecraft to reach escape velocity in January 1959, the questions in Washington became urgent. How had the Soviets achieved such technological leaps? What propulsion systems were they using? And most critically, how much of a head start did they have in the space race that everyone now understood was really an arms race in disguise? The Technical Services Division, the CIA's gadget shop, run by the methodical and unflappable Richard Bissell, had been given a singular directive from Director Allen Dulles: get us a Soviet satellite. Not photographs, not measurements taken from a distance, the actual hardware itself. Bissell, who would later oversee the development of the U-2 spy plane and become embroiled in the Bay of Pigs disaster, understood the magnitude of the request. Soviet space vehicles didn't simply fall into American hands. They were launched from the heavily guarded Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, tracked by Soviet radar networks, and when they returned to Earth, if they returned, they landed in remote regions of the USSR under immediate military custody. But Dulles had been specific. He wanted the satellite before it was launched, which meant one thing: they would have to steal it. The opportunity presented itself in the most unlikely of ways. In the summer of 1959, the Soviet Union embarked on what it called a friendship tour, a propaganda offensive designed to showcase Soviet technological achievement to the developing world. Khrushchev, emboldened by his space triumphs and eager to win influence in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, authorized a traveling exhibition featuring actual Soviet space hardware. The centerpiece would be a Lunik satellite, one of the Luna series spacecraft that had been achieving Soviet firsts in lunar exploration. The exhibition was scheduled to visit 7 countries over 6 months: Indonesia, India, Egypt, Syria, Mexico, Yugoslavia, and Morocco. To the Kremlin, it was a brilliant stroke of soft power, proof positive that Soviet science had surpassed the capitalist West. To Richard Bissell and his team at Technical Services Division, it was something else entirely: an opportunity. The problem was not simply stealing the satellite. The Soviets weren't fools. The Lunik would be accompanied at all times by a security detachment from the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence on Soviet soil and, increasingly, for protecting Soviet interests abroad. There would be at least 6 guards, rotating in 8-hour shifts. The satellite would be displayed during the day and locked in a secure warehouse at night. Local police, often sympathetic to Soviet interests, or at least intimidated by Soviet pressure, would provide additional security. And perhaps most daunting of all, the satellite itself was massive, nearly 800 pounds, roughly spherical and fragile. Moving it would require specialized equipment and expertise. You couldn't simply throw it in the back of a truck. But Bissell had an advantage that the Soviets couldn't anticipate: patience, and a willingness to fail multiple times before succeeding. The first attempt would be made in Jakarta, where the exhibition opened in August. CIA Station Chief Howard Stone had recruited a team of local assets, Indonesian intelligence officers who, despite their government's public alignment with the non-aligned movement, were deeply worried about communist expansion in Southeast Asia. The plan was simple, almost crude: bribe the warehouse night watchman, cut the power to the building, use the resulting confusion to swap the satellite with a carefully weighted replica, and be gone before dawn. It failed spectacularly. The KGB guards, rather than responding to the power outage by investigating, simply locked themselves inside the warehouse with the satellite and waited for backup. When Stone's team approached the building, they were met by Indonesian military police who had been alerted by the Soviets. The operation was blown before it truly began, though fortunately without any casualties or diplomatic incidents. The agency would have to try again. New Delhi was next, and here the CIA took a more sophisticated approach. Station Chief Robert Crowley spent weeks studying the exhibition's logistics, looking for patterns, vulnerabilities, anything that could be exploited. He discovered something interesting. The Lunik was transported between venues in a custom-built wooden crate, loaded onto a Soviet-made flatbed truck. The truck required refueling, and the Soviets, ever budget-conscious despite their propaganda about socialist plenty, used local gas stations rather than bringing their own fuel supplies. Crowley's plan relied on this regularity. His team would intercept the truck at a predetermined gas station on the route between New Delhi and the next venue in Bombay. They would disable the truck, sugar in the gas tank was the preferred method, wait for the Soviet team to call for a replacement vehicle, then pose as the local mechanics sent to fix it. While the Soviets were distracted, a second team would use a portable X-ray machine to photograph the satellite through the crate's wooden walls. It wasn't as good as having the actual satellite, but it would provide the technical data the agency desperately needed. The operation began well. The truck stopped at the designated station. The sugar did its work. The Soviets, frustrated but unsuspicious, radioed for assistance. But when Crowley's team arrived, dressed as mechanics, they found that the KGB had anticipated precisely this scenario. Rather than allow strangers near the crate, the guards formed a perimeter around the truck and waited for Soviet mechanics to arrive from the embassy. Crowley, watching from a distance through binoculars, called off the operation. They had learned a valuable lesson. The Soviets were protecting the satellite not just against theft, but against any form of intelligence gathering. Cairo presented yet another failed opportunity. By now, Bissell was beginning to wonder if the entire operation was viable. The Technical Services Division had invested enormous resources, money, personnel, equipment, in an operation that had produced nothing but setbacks. Some within the agency were suggesting it was time to cut losses and pursue other avenues. But Dulles, whose reputation had been built on bold operations during World War II when he ran OSS networks in Switzerland, insisted they continue. "We need that satellite," he told Bissell during a meeting in late September. "The president wants to know what the Soviets are capable of, and he wants to know now, not after the next surprise." The breakthrough came not from sophisticated planning, but from simple human observation. CIA officer David Murphy, stationed in Damascus where the exhibition was scheduled to appear in October, was having drinks one evening with a Syrian contact when the man mentioned something curious. The Soviet delegation was constantly fighting with the local exhibition organizers about scheduling. The Soviets wanted to display the Lunik for precisely 4 hours each day, then remove it. The Syrians wanted it on display for 8 hours to accommodate larger crowds. The arguments were becoming heated. Murphy, intrigued, did some digging. He discovered that the time restriction wasn't about security, it was about the satellite itself. The Lunik contained volatile chemicals and pressurized systems that needed to be carefully monitored. Keeping it in the display pavilion, which lacked climate control and proper ventilation, for extended periods risked damaging the spacecraft. So each evening, the Lunik was transported back to a special facility where Soviet technicians could check its systems and ensure it remained in showroom condition. This was the vulnerability Bissell had been looking for. The transport routine created a window, a brief period when the satellite was in transit, when security was focused on movement rather than static defense, when timing and coordination mattered more than manpower. But by the time Murphy's report reached Langley and Bissell could assemble a response team, the Damascus leg of the tour was over. The exhibition was moving to its next destination, Mexico City. If there was a city in the world where the CIA had both the capability and the local knowledge to pull off such an operation, it was Mexico City. The station there, run by the legendary Winston "Win" Scott, was one of the agency's largest and most capable. Scott, a former FBI agent who had joined the CIA at its founding, had spent years cultivating relationships throughout Mexican government, business, and society. More importantly, Mexico City Station had access to resources that other stations didn't. A fully equipped technical support facility, a large roster of trusted local assets, and, most critically, the cooperation, unofficial but reliable, of certain elements within Mexican intelligence who saw cooperation with the Americans as preferable to Soviet influence in the hemisphere. When Scott received the cable from Langley outlining what Bissell wanted, his response was characteristically direct. "Can do. We'll need 2 weeks to prepare, an absolute guarantee of Mexican government non-interference at highest levels." Bissell, through Dulles, made the necessary calls. President Eisenhower himself authorized a personal message to Mexican President Adolfo López Mateos, not explaining the specifics, but making clear that an operation of great importance to hemispheric security would be taking place in Mexico City, and that American intelligence would be grateful for discretion from Mexican authorities. The assurances were given, though with conditions: no violence, no embarrassment to Mexico, and if anything went wrong, the Americans would take full responsibility, and the Mexican government would publicly deny any knowledge of the operation. Scott agreed to the terms. The Soviet exhibition arrived in Mexico City on November 2, 1959. The Lunic was displayed in the Palacio de Bellas Artes, the stunning Art Nouveau palace in the historic center of the city. Crowds lined up for hours to see the satellite that had, according to Soviet propaganda, come closer to the moon than any man-made object in history. KGB security was, as expected, tight. 6 guards rotating shifts. The satellite was moved each evening to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, transported in its wooden crate on the same Soviet flatbed truck that had carried it across 2 continents. Scott's team spent the first week simply watching, documenting everything: times, routes, personnel, procedures. They photographed the truck from every angle, they measured the crate, they tracked the guards' movements and identified their habits. Which ones smoked, which ones were punctual, which ones seemed more alert than others. They mapped every kilometer of the route between the Palacio and the warehouse, identifying choke points, alternate routes, places where the truck would have to slow down. What they discovered was both encouraging and daunting. The route was consistent, the same roads, the same timing, night after night, but it was also well chosen by the Soviets. The truck traveled through busy areas where any attempted interception would be immediately noticed by witnesses. There were no isolated stretches, no convenient places where the truck might plausibly break down without arousing suspicion. Scott realized they couldn't intercept the truck in transit. They would have to take the satellite from the warehouse itself. This was, in many ways, a more dangerous proposition. The warehouse was guarded, breaking in would trigger alarms, and even if they somehow managed to bypass security, they would need hours to disassemble the crate, remove the satellite, photograph and measure every component, then reassemble everything and return it before the morning shift arrived. It was David Murphy, who had flown in from Damascus to assist, who proposed the solution.
What if they didn't break into the warehouse?
What if they convinced the Soviets to take the satellite out themselves? The plan he outlined was audacious to the point of absurdity, but the more Scott's team examined it, the more viable it seemed. They would stage an accident, a very public, very dramatic accident that would force the Soviets to remove the satellite from the warehouse for safety reasons. While the satellite was being relocated, Scott's team would intercept the transport, take possession of the crate, and have approximately 6 hours to complete their examination before the Soviets realized something was wrong. The accident would be a fire. Not a real fire, nothing that would actually endanger lives or property, but a convincing simulation. Smoke, flames, emergency vehicles, panic. The warehouse was located in an industrial district where several other storage facilities held chemicals and other potentially hazardous materials. If a fire broke out in an adjacent building, standard safety protocols would require the evacuation of all nearby structures, including the one holding the Lunik. Scott's team spent 3 days preparing. They needed the cooperation of the Mexico City Fire Department, which Win Scott secured through a combination of monetary incentives and appeals to Mexican nationalism. This was, he explained, about preventing Soviet espionage against Mexican interests. They needed smoke machines, fireworks to simulate explosions, and several trucks marked with fire department insignia. They needed a secure facility where the satellite could be taken for examination, staffed with technical experts who could work under extreme time pressure. And they needed a replacement crate, identical in every detail to the Soviet original, which could be substituted if the opportunity arose. The operation was scheduled for the night of November 9th. Scott's team had learned that the following day, November 10th, was when the exhibition would be dismantled and prepared for transport to its next destination in Belgrade. This meant it was the last opportunity they would have. After November 10th, the satellite would leave Mexico, and with it any chance of access. At 11:47 p.m. on November 9th, a chemical storage facility 3 buildings down from the warehouse holding the Lunik erupted in apparent flames. Smoke poured from the windows, actually created by a dozen military-grade smoke generators placed inside by Scott's team earlier that evening. Explosions echoed through the industrial district, fireworks rigged to create maximum noise and flash. Within minutes, fire trucks arrived, their sirens wailing. The fire chief, who was among those cooperating with the CIA, immediately ordered the evacuation of all nearby buildings. The KGB guards at the warehouse were initially resistant. Their orders were explicit. Do not leave the satellite unguarded under any circumstances, but as the fire chief explained with increasing urgency that there were pressurized chemical tanks in the burning building that might explode at any moment, sending shrapnel and toxic fumes across the entire district, the senior guard made the decision to move the satellite. He radioed the Soviet embassy for instructions and was told to relocate the Lunik to an alternate, secure location, a facility the embassy used for storing sensitive materials. The wooden crate was loaded onto the flatbed truck. 2 of the guards rode in the cab with the driver. The other 4 followed in a sedan. They pulled out of the warehouse compound at 12:23 a.m., headed for the embassy storage facility on the other side of the city. They never arrived. 3 blocks from the warehouse, at a major intersection, the traffic lights malfunctioned, or appeared to. The flatbed truck, having the right-of-way, proceeded through the intersection. A large delivery truck, seemingly unable to stop, collided with it at low speed. The impact was carefully calculated, hard enough to disable the Soviet truck's engine, but not hard enough to damage the crate in the back. Both vehicles came to a stop, blocking the intersection. The KGB guards immediately surrounded the crate, weapons drawn. But what happened next disarmed their suspicions. A Mexico City police car arrived within seconds, followed by 2 more. Officers in uniform began directing traffic around the accident. An ambulance pulled up. The delivery truck driver appeared to be injured, though not seriously. A tow truck arrived to clear the disabled vehicles. It was textbook accident response, so routine and bureaucratic that the Soviet guards, while remaining vigilant, began to relax. This was not an attack. This was simple bad luck, the kind of thing that happened in large cities where traffic was chaotic and drivers were reckless. The senior guard radioed the embassy to report the delay and request a replacement vehicle. What the KGB guards didn't realize was that every person at that intersection, the police officers, the ambulance crew, the tow truck driver, even several of the bystanders who had stopped to watch, were working for Win Scott. And while they waited for the Soviet embassy to send a replacement truck, a switch was being executed with precision timing that would have impressed any stage magician. The tow truck driver explained that he would need to lift the Soviet flatbed to access the disabled engine. The guards agreed, but insisted on remaining beside the crate. As the flatbed was lifted, a second tow truck arrived, ostensibly to remove the delivery truck that had caused the accident. This truck positioned itself directly behind the Soviet flatbed, close enough that its bed was almost touching the crate. At 12:47 a.m., the police received a radio call. Another fire had broken out, this time at a construction site 2 blocks away. Smoke was visible in the night sky. The officers at the intersection were ordered to respond immediately. They apologized to the Soviet guards and rushed off, leaving just 2 policemen to manage traffic. These 2, both CIA assets, positioned themselves at either end of the intersection, directing the growing number of vehicles around the accident scene. Their positioning was deliberate. Neither had a clear line of sight to the space between the 2 tow trucks. Between 12:47 and 1:03 a.m., a span of just 16 minutes, David Murphy and a team of 4 technical specialists removed the wooden crate from the Soviet flatbed, loaded it onto the second tow truck, and replaced it with an identical crate that had been hidden in the tow truck's bed. The replacement crate was weighted with concrete blocks to match the satellite's mass. The team worked in near silence, using specially designed jacks and rollers to move the crate without triggering any of the anti-tamper mechanisms the Soviets might have installed. By the time the KGB guards completed their circuit around the accident scene, they were still making regular patrols, still vigilant. The switch had been made. The crate they were now guarding contained 800 pounds of concrete, carefully arranged to shift and settle exactly like the satellite would if the crate were moved. They had no idea. At 1:15 a.m., a replacement Soviet truck arrived from the embassy. The crate was transferred under the watchful eyes of the guards. At 1:34 a.m., the convoy departed the intersection and completed its journey to the embassy storage facility. The guards reported the incident to their superiors as an unfortunate but minor delay caused by local traffic incompetence. The satellite was secured. Everything was in order. Meanwhile, the real Lunik was being driven at high speed to a warehouse in the Tlalpan district on the southern edge of Mexico City. The facility had been rented under a false corporate front 3 weeks earlier and equipped with everything the technical team would need: X-ray machines, cameras, measuring instruments, chemical analysis equipment, and most importantly, tools to disassemble the crate without leaving any evidence of tampering. The team that examined the Lunik that night represented the CIA's finest technical minds. There were aerospace engineers from the nascent American space program who had been covertly seconded to the agency. There were chemists who specialized in propulsion systems. There were electronics experts who understood Soviet manufacturing techniques. And there was one man, never identified publicly, who had worked on classified American satellite projects and knew exactly what to look for. They had until dawn, approximately 4.5 hours, to complete their work. The timeline was based on one critical factor. The Soviet guards would inspect the crate when they delivered it to the embassy facility, but they would not open it. Opening the crate required specialized tools and expertise, and more importantly, it would disturb the satellite's carefully calibrated systems. The Soviets would only open the crate the following morning, when technicians arrived to prepare the satellite for transport to Yugoslavia. That gave Scott's team until approximately 9 a.m. to return the satellite and substitute it for the concrete-filled crate at the embassy facility. The examination began at 1:52 a.m. The wooden crate was carefully unsealed, each nail removed and labeled so it could be replaced in precisely the same position. Inside, wrapped in protective foam and secured with canvas straps, was the Lunik itself. What they saw took their breath away. The satellite was more sophisticated than American analysts had believed possible. The spherical body was constructed from an aluminum-magnesium alloy that was both lighter and stronger than materials being used in American satellites. The surface was covered with sensors and instruments that had clearly been designed with extreme attention to weight reduction. Every gram mattered when you were trying to reach escape velocity. There were solar panels of a design that NASA engineers had only
Theoretically proposed.
There was a radio transmitter that appeared to operate on frequencies outside the standard range, making it harder to track and intercept. But the real revelation was inside. When the team carefully removed the satellite's outer shell, a process that took nearly an hour and required temporary heating elements to soften the sealant, they discovered a propulsion system that answered the question that had been haunting American intelligence since Sputnik. How were the Soviets achieving such powerful launches? The answer was efficiency. Where American rocket designers were pursuing ever larger engines, creating more thrust through brute force, the Soviets had taken a different path. The Lunik's propulsion system used a staged combustion cycle that extracted more energy from the same amount of fuel. The engine components were manufactured to tolerances that American facilities couldn't match, and the fuel itself, the team took samples for analysis, appeared to be a hypergolic mixture that ignited on contact, eliminating the need for ignition systems and their associated weight. The implications were staggering. The Soviets weren't just ahead in the space race, they were ahead in ways that suggested fundamental differences in engineering philosophy and manufacturing capability. This wasn't something the Americans could simply copy. It would require rethinking entire approaches to rocket design. The team photographed every component from multiple angles. They measured, they sketched, they took detailed notes. They removed small samples of materials for later analysis, fragments so tiny that their absence would never be noticed. They even discovered the satellite's serial number, etched on an internal component, which would allow the CIA to track whether this specific satellite ever appeared in Soviet propaganda again. At 5:47 a.m., with dawn approaching, the team began reassembling the satellite. This was, in many ways, more difficult than disassembly. Everything had to go back exactly as it had been. The sealant had to be reheated and reapplied. The outer shell had to be aligned perfectly with the internal components. The sensors and instruments had to be reconnected to their power sources. Any mistake, any misalignment, and Soviet technicians would immediately know the satellite had been tampered with. By 6:34 a.m., the Lunik was back in its protective foam, back in its wooden crate, each nail driven in exactly where it had been before. The crate was loaded onto a nondescript delivery truck, the kind used by Mexican businesses to transport goods throughout the city. Nothing about it would attract attention. The final stage of the operation was, in some ways, the most audacious. Scott's team had to break into the Soviet embassy storage facility and replace the concrete-filled crate with the real satellite. This would normally be impossible. The embassy compound was Soviet territory, heavily guarded, monitored by cameras and sensors. An intrusion would be detected immediately and create a massive diplomatic incident. But Win Scott had one more trick. Among his assets was a senior official in the Mexican telephone company. Not a spy, just a man who believed that Mexico's interests aligned more closely with the United States than with the Soviet Union. That morning at 7:15 a.m., the telephone lines to the Soviet embassy went dead. All of them: phone, telex, the encrypted communication channels. It appeared to be a massive system failure, possibly caused by overnight construction work that had accidentally damaged underground cables. The Soviets, unable to communicate with the outside world, did what anyone would do in such a situation. They called for repairmen. Or rather, they sent someone to the telephone company office to demand immediate service. The telephone company, after proper bureaucratic delays, dispatched a repair crew to the embassy at 8:23 a.m. The crew, of course, worked for Win Scott, and they brought with them more than just tools for fixing telephone lines. Hidden in their repair truck was the crate containing the Lunik. What happened next was a masterpiece of misdirection. While 3 of the telephone repairmen worked on the communications problem, actually causing additional minor issues to ensure they would need to remain on site for several hours, 2 others asked permission to access the embassy's storage facility. They explained that the telephone cables ran through the building and they needed to check for damage inside the walls. The Soviet officials, frustrated by the communications blackout and eager to have it resolved, agreed. The storage facility was guarded by 2 KGB officers who had been on duty all night. They were tired, irritated by the telephone problems, and not particularly concerned about a couple of Mexican telephone workers who had been cleared by embassy officials. When the workers asked to move some of the stored items to access a wall junction bomb, the guards agreed, but insisted on supervising. This was where years of practice in sleight of hand and misdirection paid off. While one worker created a distraction, he accidentally knocked over a stack of boxes, creating a mess that required the guard's attention. The other moved the concrete-filled crate out of the storage area and brought in the crate containing the real Lunik. The switch took less than 90 seconds. The workers apologized profusely for the clumsiness, offered to help clean up, and were curtly dismissed by the annoyed guards. At 9:47 a.m., the telephone repair crew left the Soviet embassy. The communications problems had been resolved. A senior embassy official even thanked them for their prompt service. No one noticed that the repair truck, which had arrived carrying equipment and tools, left carrying exactly the same load, except that one of the equipment boxes now contained 800 pounds of concrete that would eventually be dumped in an industrial site on the outskirts of Mexico City. At 10:15 a.m., Soviet technicians arrived at the storage facility to prepare the Lunik for transport. They inspected the crate, confirmed the seals were intact, and using specialized equipment, carefully opened it. Inside was the satellite, exactly as it should be. They ran diagnostic tests. All systems were functional. There was no indication that anything unusual had occurred. The satellite was loaded onto a truck bound for the airport, where it would be flown to Belgrade for the next leg of the exhibition tour. The operation had been a complete success. But for Win Scott and his team, the most nerve-wracking part was yet to come, waiting to see if the Soviets noticed. Days passed, then weeks. The exhibition continued through Yugoslavia and Morocco. Soviet technicians handled the satellite daily, running tests, making adjustments. If they discovered any evidence of tampering, they gave no sign. No diplomatic protests were filed. No investigations were launched. The Soviet press continued to trumpet the Lunik exhibition as proof of socialist technological superiority. At Langley, Richard Bissell and his team pored over the intelligence gathered from that one night in Mexico City. The technical data was sent to NASA, where it influenced the design of American satellites for years to come. The propulsion system insights were shared with rocket engineers working on the Mercury and Gemini programs. The materials analysis led to new research into aluminum alloys and manufacturing techniques. But perhaps the most valuable insight wasn't technical. It was psychological. The operation had demonstrated something that American intelligence needed to know. Soviet security, while thorough and professional, was not infallible. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Soviet space achievements since Sputnik was just that, an aura. The Soviets made mistakes. They could be deceived. They were ultimately human. Win Scott would go on to serve as Mexico City station chief for another decade, overseeing operations that included surveillance of Lee Harvey Oswald during his suspicious visit to the Soviet and Cuban embassies in September 1963, just weeks before the Kennedy assassination. Richard Bissell would rise to deputy director for plans before the Bay of Pigs disaster ended his career. Alan Dulles would be forced to resign as CIA director in 1961, taking the blame for Cuba's fiasco. But the Lunik operation remains secret. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged that its satellite had been compromised. American officials, even after the Cold War ended, remained tight-lipped about the specifics. The full story only emerged decades later in heavily redacted CIA documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests. To this day, historians debate certain details. Some accounts claim the operation took place in Indonesia, not Mexico. Others suggest the satellite was examined in a CIA facility rather than on location. Some former agency officials have hinted that similar operations were conducted against other Soviet space hardware, though no documentation has been released to confirm these claims. What is certain is that on one November night in 1959, in a warehouse on the outskirts of Mexico City, American intelligence achieved something that seemed impossible. They stole a satellite from under the noses of the KGB, examined it in minute detail, and returned it without the Soviets ever knowing it had been gone. It was, in the assessment of one senior CIA official years later, the perfect operation, because to this day, the other side doesn't know they lost. The Lunik would continue its propaganda tour, eventually being displayed in museums throughout the Soviet Union. Photographs show Khrushchev himself standing beside it, beaming with pride at Soviet achievement. The satellite became a symbol of the space race, proof that the USSR had pulled ahead of the Americans in the competition for technological supremacy. What those photographs don't show, what no one except a handful of CIA officers and technical specialists knew, is that the satellite Khrushchev was so proud of had already told the Americans everything they needed to know about how the Soviets had gotten so far ahead, and more importantly, how the Americans could catch up. In the great game of intelligence, some victories are measured in lives saved or wars prevented. Others are measured in secrets stolen or agents turned. But occasionally, very occasionally, a victory is measured in something simpler. In knowing what your adversary knows, in understanding how they think, in having the technical blueprint that allows you to compete on equal terms. The Lunik operation gave the United States all of that, and the Soviets never knew they'd given it away.